Our second speaker is Mark Payne. He is professor of classics and a professor also in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. He is the author of two books. The first, Theocritus and the Invention of Fiction, was published by Cambridge in 2007. And his second book, The Animal Part, Human and Other Animals in the Poetic Imagination, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2010, which received the Warren Brooks Award for Outstanding Literary Criticism. The title of his paper today is The Choric Con-sociality of Nonhuman Life. Thank you.
So I want to begin by thanking Emma, Sarah, and Brooke for the invitation to be here. My paper is all about poetry as a gateway to expanded possibilities of living with. So unlike Sarah, I'm going to have to crave a total rather than a partial indulgence as I begin. And I'm also going to sort of dive in right at a critical juncture in Schiller's On Naive and Sentimental Poetry. So Schiller has explained his distinction between the two kinds of poetry. Naive poetry is produced when the forms of human sociality are informed by the naturalness of human life, whereas sentimental poetry is produced when social forms have lost touch with this naturalness. At such times, Schiller claims, poets will appear as nature's, quote, witnesses and avengers. And he goes on to delineate what their proxyhood looks like in poetry that comes after naturalness and constitutes itself as a unique site of access to the natural. So what I want to attend to here is how we get from the natural to the historical. In Schiller's invitation to the reader to imagine Greek naturalness as participation in a more than human community. So the long quote from On Naive and Sentimental Poetry. Let nature surround you like a lovely idyll, in which again and again you find the way back to yourself from the aberrations of art and gather courage and new confidence about the course of life, so that the flame of the ideal, so easily extinguished in life's storms, is rekindled in your heart. Recall the beauty of nature surrounding the ancient Greeks. Consider how confidently this people was able, under its serendipitous sky, to live with nature in the wild. Consider how very much nearer to the simplicity of nature lay its manner of thinking, its way of thinking, its mores, and what a faithful copy of this is provided by the works of the poets. Nature surrounded the Greeks, and Schiller urges his reader to adopt a disposition to be surrounded. Umgeben is his verb in both the exhortation, let nature surround you, and the historical invocation, recall the beauty of nature surrounding the ancient Greeks. The experience of being surrounded in the present enacts an occluded potential of human being for more than human community, and so affords an understanding of what it was like to live as a Greek. It is an orienting experience of living with non-human life that contrasts with a disorienting labyrinthine errancy in merely human sociality. Being surrounded by nature is how you find your way back to yourself from the aberrations of an artificial life. So it's this idea that I mean to indicate with my somewhat unwieldy title, The Choric Con-sociality of non-human life. The feeling of being surrounded by the orienting presence of non-human life that gives particular forms of human sociality their distinctive character. In On Naive and Sentimental Poetry, Schiller does not dwell on the agency of non-human entities in enacting this experience of con-sociality, beyond making nature the active subject of both instances of Umgeben. But he does consider this agency more fully in the letters on aesthetic education. In the 24th letter, he claims that free subjectivity is preceded by a condition of what he calls immediate contact with the world, in which objects press in upon us to destroy us, and that it is only because kindly nature invites us to do so that we learn to distinguish ourselves from things. The 25th letter suggests that it is because the Greeks so fully responded to this invitation that their art has its exemplary character. Con-sociality is the acceptance of this invitation and what makes Greek art a perpetual homecoming for a humanity that has wandered away from its naturalness. By contrast, he imagines a world in which free subjectivity has not emerged because what is, quote, sheer mass, ponderous and inchoate, its murky contours shifting with uncertain boundaries, has not allowed it to emerge. This empire of the Titans, as Schiller calls it, with the power to determine the inner experience of human beings according to the dictates of its own materiality, has its origin in Greek anxieties about titanic nature and its power to intervene in human subject formation. Etna is the classic site for such anxieties, insofar as it lays claim to the witness for its own self-realization. Its wondrousness undoes object relations and plunges the human subject back into a childhood world of involuntary mimesis, in which this aesthetic post-subject performs the features of the directing non-human entity automatically. So what I want to suggest that we are dealing with here is a difference between modes of interpolation. On the one hand, kindly nature's call to intersubjectivity that gives the human being to itself as a free reflective consciousness. And on the other, titanic nature's availing itself of the human being so as to lock it into a subjection to the interpolator that does not emerge into intersubjectivity as such. Interpolation here is my translation of the term Aufordnung from Fichte's Foundations of Natural Right and System of Ethics, which are almost exactly contemporary with Schiller's lectures on aesthetic education and on naive and sentimental poetry, and with the two parts of Holderlin's Hyperion, which I will turn to shortly. Fichte's interpolation that leads to reflective consciousness can only proceed from one free rational subject to another, and the I to which it is directed may accordingly need more than one opportunity to constitute itself in accord with this interpolation. Precisely because I am free, Fichte claims, the interpolation does not compel me to reflect. Instead, I reflect with absolute spontaneity. In the system of ethics, Fichte is not interested in interpolation by non-human entities or the abortive subjectivity that emerges from Schiller's titanic mode of interpolation. We are not charged with the task of bringing society into existence by ourselves, he says, and suggests that, quote, if a person were, let us say, born in the wilderness, he would surely be permitted to remain there. In the Foundations of Natural Right, however, he does address the question that he says has been raised with good reason about the idea of interpolation, namely, quote, which effects can be explained only by reference to a rational cause. The answer he gives is that the production of cognition is the only effect that has an indubitably rational cause, and that the multiple occasions of the interpolation that invite us to it, cognition, are what we call upbringing, Erziehung. All human beings, he says, must be brought up to be human beings. Otherwise, they would not be human beings. Here, then, we do hear an echo of Schiller's failure of becoming human. And while the upbringing of human beings by human beings is the only scene of interpolation that Fichte is interested in, The idea that non-human entities raise human beings is fundamental to Romanticism, and invoking it here sets the scene of interpolation within the project of theorizing and staging the constitutive role of external agency in the making of the human subject, in which Schiller and Hölderlin also participate. My interest then in moving now from Schiller and Fichte to Hölderlin is to investigate the place of particularity in this process of interpolation, insofar as it is thought to be directed by non-human agents to a human proto-subject. How do particular non-human entities intervene in the process of human subject formation? And how does this intervention lead to the grounding of human sociality in what I've called the Choric Con-sociality of Nonhuman life, a salvific alternative to human errancy in an orientation towards the totality of life that is inaugurated by natural entities themselves? So, interpolation by non-human entities, the outcome of which is the experience of chorality, is constitutive of the lyric plots of Hölderlin's landscape poetry of the late 1790s. The Neckar, the Main, among others, where the experience of chorality is also the gateway to an understanding of the historicity of Greek life, much as Schiller envisages in On Naive and Sentimental Poetry. The contrast between chorality and errancy is also theorized as the outcome of the historical appearance of reflective consciousness in the activity of the human creative drive, in the standpoint from which we should consider Antiquity, which is from the same period, 1799. The emergence of reflective consciousness in the drive to make form out of natural appearing discloses the difference between, quote, the essential directions that this drive took before us and around us, on the one hand, and, quote, its strayings around us on the other. Reflective consciousness produces the creative drive as an object of understanding in its natural and artificial forms, and thereby affords the possibility for a transhistorical experience of human creativity as it is called forth by the presence of nature. In its disclosure of a continuous ground of human making that manifests itself in more and less complete accommodations of the creative nature within human beings with the creative nature around them, reflective consciousness is what allows the naturalness of the human drive, this human drive, to return to itself as an activity in the present. Now, alongside the retrospective account of chorality in the lyric poetry as the child's awakening to life by rivers and hills and other such natural entities, and the theorization of chorality in the notebooks and letters, Hölderlin's novel Hyperion avails itself of novelistic narrativity and characterology to stage interpolation as a subjective event in the life of its protagonist. On Hyperion's first visit to the island of Calauria, nature surrounds him like a lovely idyll, as human beings are folded into an experience of the Choric Con-sociality of Nonhuman life that is enacted by the maternal air. I have a long quote here. As when a mother cajolingly asks where her dearest pet has got to, and all her children come rushing to her lap, and even the littlest reaches out its arms from the cradle, so every life flew and leaped and struggled out into the divine air, and beetles and swallows and doves and storks circled together in joyous confusion in its depths and heights. And the steps of all that were earthbound became flight. The horse charged over the furrows and the deer over the hedges. The fish came up from the bottom of the sea and leaped over the surface. The motherly air affected the hearts of all, uplifted them and drew them to her. And men came out of their doors, and wonderfully did they feel the ethereal breeze as it lightly moved the fine hairs over their forehead, as it cooled the sun's ray. and happily they loosed their garments to receive it upon their chests, and breathed more sweetly, felt more gently touched by the light, cool, soothing sea in which they lived and breathed and had their being. Hyperion is disposed to the experience of the chorality of non-human life in the present by his understanding of Greece in antiquity as a place where, quote, the sun god lived amid the divine festivals at which all Greece shone round him like a ray of golden clouds. All Hyperion's experiences of intersubjectivity, including his human friendships, are patterned after this conception of the foundational role of non-human entities in ancient Greek life. When he meets his friend Alabander after the failure of their nationalist ambitions, he describes how his, quote, large, ever-animated eye shone upon me from his faded face like the midday sun from a pallid heaven. Alabander's effect upon Hyperion is to recall him to himself and to provide his life with an organizing center, like the foundational role of the sun in gathering ancient Greek life around itself. Hyperion's disposition to the chorality of non-human life predates his meeting with his lover Diotima, and the figuration of living with non-human life in foundational choral terms is very much his own. Diotima prefers the image of the household in which, quote, each member, without exactly thinking about it, adapts himself to all the others and, quote, all live pleasing and rejoicing one another simply because that is what springs from their hearts. This labile, multi-relational conception of the household embraces most immediately the kindly trees around her house, in whose presence she imagines herself as, quote, a blossom among the blossoms, and in the company of trusted confidants who nod to her as a friend. These two versions of being surrounded resonate with one another throughout the novel, both as ways of imagining forms of sociality that include non-human life, and as ways of thinking about intersubjectivity within that expanded sociality. Diotima understands living with non-human beings as a process of mutual understanding that, like confidential friendship, unfolds over time. This understanding contrasts with Hyperion's experience of chorality as a decisive foundational orientation enacted through the agency of natural entities, and especially the sun. The contrast is never disharmonious, but Diotima does interrogate Hyperion's belief that his experience of chorality in the present can afford an experience of Greek antiquity in the present as still living in its relics. When she asks him about the gateway to the past afforded by a choral disposition towards nature that is continuous with that of the Greeks, he reiterates an earlier expression of his belief that the centering of Greek life in nature by nature can be re-experienced in the present by a sudden, decisive restructuring of object relations that is in the giving of the Greek landscape. Quote, even as the sun in the heavens found itself again in the 1,000 changes of light that the earth sent back to him, so my spirit recognized itself in the fullness of life that was all about it, that beset it from every side. The messaging between subjects in the cosmos as a whole is reenacted within the individual human being, and the micro-chorality of the individual's relationship to nature is the ground of the macro-chorality of the group. The contrast between spatial orientations in the standpoint, wandering versus being at the center, appears in Hyperion as the contrast between closing and opening to nature in the life of a historical people. This alternation is recapitulated in every human life and is figured in contrasting mythological spaces. On the one hand, the labyrinth in which one wanders without the guidance of light. On the other, Delos' standpoint at the center of the Cyclades. Mittelpunkt, by the way, is just how Hölderlin renders omphalos in his Pindar translations, and that's the same word here. So of these two versions of being surrounded in the novel, it will be Diotima's that survives. By the end of the novel, Alabanda is no longer the orienting figure of the sun. He is a tree, once firm and slender, but now moldering, whose chips boys will gather to make a merry fire. This image is followed by Hyperion's comparison of his voyage to Germany with blind Oedipus's journey to the gates of Athens. The tree that has outlived its beauty and is now ready for the fire recalls Pindar's image of Oedipus in Pythian 4 as a disfigured trunk whose last relation to human life consists in being burnt. In Germany, Hyperion becomes like Diotima as he is included in a confidential relationship with its trees. He recalls that in his state of desolation, he, quote, lived with the blooming trees as with geniuses, and the clear brooks that flowed under them whispered the care from my heart like divine voices. Foundational relationships with natural entities of the highest ontic prestige are replaced by the friendship of more modest forms of non-human life, with whom his own form of life is more nearly akin. The consolation the trees afford is not simply the common mortality of their rotten fruit, but the shared life that has death as one of its commonalities. Shared nutrition and shared delight in the sky as the ultimate source of maternal nutrition recall the motherly air of Calaria and build towards the novel's final radiant image of the tree of blood inside the human body. Quote, like lovers' quarrels are the dissonances of the world. Reconciliation is there, even in the midst of strife, and all things that are parted find one another again. The arteries separate and return to the heart, and all is one eternal glowing life. The dissonance between Hyperion and Diotima's versions of chorality never becomes a quarrel, but the two strands do remain apart from one another, like veins and arteries, or the co-presence of Sapphic and Pindaric poetology in Hölderlin's late work. The two versions of chorality are not resolved, except insofar as the retrospective character of the narration can be said to have afforded Hyperion an opportunity to bring Diotima's version to light as a mode of idyllic experience that was not available to him at the time of his lived experience. This is a modality of reflection that Hyperion calls gleaning, Ehrenlesen, the search for a salvific remainder in a prior constellation of experience that is made available for reflective consciousness in the present in a way that would not have been possible for the original agents themselves. So the long version of this paper now moves on to consider the afterlife of Hyperion's version of chorality in the work of Martin Heidegger, and in particular, the contrast between errancy and chorality in his lecture course on Sophocles' Ode to Man, in which the polis is reimagined as polos, right? The pole, the swirl, wirbel is Heidegger's term, in which and around which everything turns. And the claim is made that the essentially polar character of the polis concerns beings as a whole, right? As opposed to the exclusively human Mitsein that interpolates Dasein in being and time. So I'm going to skip that section here, and I'm going to return to Schiller's suggestion on naive and sentimental poetry, that it is in the Hellenistic period that the ancient Greek form of life loses its naturalness, and that the index of this loss is an emerging consciousness of the role that kindly nature played in the formation of earlier Greek sociality, along with an effort to thematize this role on the part of poets who may also adapt the role of nature's witnesses and avengers in the wake of the loss of naturalness, this loss of naturalness from the historical form of Greek life. So, and I'm particularly interested in whether the sort of retrospective attention that the Hellenistic poets give to nature is of the kind that Hölderlin calls gleaning, right? And in the long version of the paper, I have something to say in this regard about each of the major Hellenistic poets. But right now, I'm just going to focus on the chorographic imagination of Callimachus, in whose hymns the agency of natural entities has an important place. And in particular, I'm going to focus on his sixth hymn, which features a clear and explicit scene of interpolation. So the sixth hymn to the goddess Demeter tells the story of Erysichthon, a figure from the heroic age, who one day gathers his gigantic henchmen and sets off to cut down a poplar tree in a grove that the goddess Demeter loves. In this grove, fruit trees and wild trees grow together in a primeval forest so dense you can hardly shoot an arrow between their trunks. The tree that Erysichthon chooses to fell is so tall it reaches to the sky, and when struck with the axe, it cries aloud. Demeter hears and hurries to the scene in disguise, but Erysichthon will not heed her warnings. He threatens to cut her down too, as he is intent on making a mead hall for his comrades. And at this point, Demeter manifests her divinity. Her feet remain rooted to the ground, but her head, like the top of her tree, reaches all the way to Olympus. She lets Erysichthon finish his work, but punishes him with insatiable hunger. Now the poem changes character. We leave behind the world of primeval forests, magical trees, and half-human giant men for Erysichthon's home, which is where his punishment is enacted. Callers come to seek him out for civic and social events, and his parents experience an all-too-human embarrassment in the face of his hunger. The excuses with which they try to conceal it and him from visitors, he can't come to a party, for example, because he fell out of his chariot, map a human world whose forms of relationality are drastically limited in comparison to the scene of Erysichthon's crime. As Erysichthon's body withers away in hunger, his life world shrinks to human beings alone, and their relationships with one another are stultifying and claustrophobic in comparison to the open horizons of relationality in which his story began. Erysichthon is punished for harming what is sacred to a god, but it is the form of his punishment that reveals why what he harmed was sacred to a god in the first place. He eats all his family's domestic animals, which include mules they keep for transportation, an ox awaiting sacrifice, horses for racing and for war, and a cat for catching mice. These animals are at hand for him to eat because they have already been instrumentalized for human use, and their distribution throughout the household, apart from one another, in places assigned to them according to their operationalization by human intelligence, contrasts with the con-sociality of the fruit trees and wild trees in Demeter's grove. Growing together and at random, the trees are interesting to the goddess as entities that live together in self-care, and it is as such that Erysichthon's victim is allowed to fall. The goddess warns, but she does not intervene, for to intervene would be to domesticate the tree, to own it like the animals of a human household. In the scene of interpolation, Demeter calls Erysichthon my child, Technon, 3 times in succession. Having failed to acknowledge the interpolation of Demeter's tree, its cry, Erysichthon gets 3 more chances from Demeter herself to recognize that in the grove he is in the presence of other free subjects. Not heeding the goddess's interpolation, he looks at her, quote, more fiercely than a lioness in the mountains of Timaris looks at a hunter when she has just given birth. And this ferocity is his last moment of freedom before he becomes completely dependent on others as a result of Demeter's punishment. The insatiable hunger that requires non-stop devotion to the task of feeding him on the part of his household is a hypertrophic condition of dependence that ends only when he is finally ejected from the house to become a homeless beggar in the street, outside all forms of relationality other than momentary occasions of charity. In Erysichthon's Gregor Samsa's story, in which Callimachus participates as fully as we are told that Kafka did in his, it is the failure to recognize what exists through self-care that exposes the emptiness of need-based forms of relationality. The use relations with domestic animals that are immediately fungible as food, and the mutual dependence of the human household whose care is exhausted with the food supply. What is talionic about Erysichthon's punishment is not simply that it is a life for a life, but that it obliges him to recognize that in the extremity of his suffering, he too is a being who exists through self-care and who may or may not be of interest to others as such. In the hymn to Demeter, Erysichthon's story is framed by a ritual celebration of Demeter as an agricultural deity. Erysichthon appears as a kind of culture hero in negative. He is punished for the harm he does to primordial nature, but on the other side of his crime lie the normative relations to non-human life in the society within which his story is told. And it is only by reimagining his ancient crime that access is possible to the expanded forms of relationality that were available in that world. True to what Bruno Snell called his post-philosophical style, Callimachus offers no explanation of his fable, explicit or otherwise. Erysichthon makes his fatal misstep when the family daimon becomes vexed. And while Demeter in disguise pleads with him to desist, she does not stay his hand. Something blocks Erysichthon's understanding of his place in nature, and Demeter, in her kindly instantiation as nature's witness, cannot reorient him, but must act as nature's avenger instead, afflicting him with insatiability as the punishment that fits his crime. In the place of explanation, we have the narrator's disavowal of Erysichthon in the frame drama. May I not share a wall with one whom Demeter hates. I loathe bad neighbors. Erysichthon is the figure of failed con-sociality, and it may be worth noting in this regard that that's where the Ode to Man ends too, from the sort of uncanniness of mastery over nature to the sort of the corruption of the figure of the neighbor. So the hymn to Demeter does not just compress epochs of human relationality to nature into the story of a single human life. Rather, it divides these epochs by a single punctual moment in this life, such that the life of Erysichthon mirrors the poem's articulation as an embedded narrative of primordial relationality on the one hand, and on the other, the normative human relations to the non-human that supplant this primordial relationality in the frame drama that surrounds it. A similar constellation of Demeter worship, hubristic violence, and access to the primordial appears in the complex structure of Theocritus's Idyll 7. Sarmikidas, the poet's proxy, ends his journey through the landscape of Kos, in the course of which he encounters the ur-goatherd Lycidas and his little song from the mountains, at a festival of agricultural Demeter. In this poem, her festival is again a gateway to the ancient spirit of the wild. While drinking her wine, the poet is surrounded by the voices of poplar and elm, insects, frogs, and birds that mingle with the sound of holy water. And he wonders whether he might be drinking such liquor as Chiron once served to Heracles in the cave of Pholus, or that made Polyphemus dance among his mountain stock pens, preludes to scenes of mythic violence between primordial non-human beings and their human antagonists. What happens in Idyll 7 is more than just Siegfried drinking the dragon's blood. As the grove of the hymn to Demeter is what allows the before and after picture of Erysichthon to be understood as a double portrait of two distinct forms of human life. So interpolation by idyllic surrounding nature in Idyll 7 is what affords imaginative access to the rude life of early humanity and its con-sociality with primordial non-human life. The centaurs and cyclops of Idyll 7 are an evanescent glimpse of that early life, the visionary fulfillment of a poem that ends by asking Demeter for a repetition of the conditions that brought it into being. In conclusion, then, it is the relationship between textual practice and the intimacy of reading that these poems, it is in the relationship between textual practice and the intimacy of reading that these poems stage the discoverability of a primordial form of life, and so constitute themselves as a proxy of nature. Multiple framings enable the work of gleaning as we pursue an evanescent experience of relationality through multiple layers of exclusion. As when Plotinus claims that the good holds beauty before it like a shield, our externality to another form of life becomes the condition of self-recovery, of reorientation and return from errancy. And it is in this indistinction between the work of the poem and the work of nature that Schiller locates the salvific potency of the idyll, which is both the poem of nature and nature itself. Quote, "Let nature surround you like a lovely idyll, in which again and again you find the way back to yourself from the aberrations of art and gather courage and new confidence about the course of life." Thank you.
I wanted to think a little bit about, it was a wonderful paper, thank you very much, about the framing in terms of Schiller and German idealism and so forth. And one of the things that I is very interesting is that my understanding of the kind of Greek thinking of nature at this time is that one of its opposites, if you like, is to think about other relationships to nature, which are not Greek, right? And one of the oppositions that keeps returning is either a kind of Asiatic or a kind of Judaic relationship to nature, which is a form of pure materialism, in which the separation, the kind of relationship between freedom and subjectivity and pure materiality is articulated in a completely different way. So anyway, so that's the sort of background. But I was also, so in that context, I was thinking, so that the con-sociality is precisely what the Judaic is not able to do. It's because it's mired in pure materialism. But in that sort of context, it made me start thinking about, the sort of broader religious context of some of these debates, and to what extent the investment in Greece is performing some sort of relationship to other kind of religious thoughts about nature in our thinking both today and, mainly in our thinking today, but does that make sense?
Right, yeah. I might have to have you come back to talk about this today, but I mean, I skipped over that part a bit in talking about Schiller. I mean, because he sort of, he has it both ways. I mean, he says on the one hand that, this reign of the Titans is the form of life in these sort of ghastly Asiatic, is his word, empires. Yet, on the other hand, he explicitly sort of labels it as Titanic, right? So, the anxiety itself is actually kind of drawn from inside the, this sort of, bifurcated Greek experience of nature. So, I was thinking about it, less in terms of, what Schiller's objectives might be, in relation to kind of, contemporary thinking about sort of versions of religiosity, and more in terms of how he is trying to sort of draw out that kind of sort of doubleness, right? Within a sort of historical Greek experience, while at the same time saying, you know, the Greek experience is the one that gives con-sociality. But I mean, in terms of contemporary thinking about religious life, I mean, I haven't thought about that. So if you've got, you know, if you'd like to say something about that, I mean, I'd love to hear it.
Maybe I'll say something.
Okay. All right.
So I wanted to go back to the scene with Erysichthon in light of, I mean, we've been talking about this, so I feel a little bit bad taking time, but in Ramona's paper on the daimonion, and the way that that encounter, that interpolation happens with a no, and what that means for you in terms of thinking about the kind of ethical encounter with nature and the kind of knowing of nature, because you could imagine sort of locating that within a broader tradition of thinking. I mean, there's one hand where nature sort of emerges and becomes visible, sort of, you know, in a Heideggerian, sort of on its own terms, and then there's this other, almost kind of, I mean, not technical is not quite the right word, but where like nature sort of only becomes visible through the symptom when something goes wrong, and sort of emerges at the moment that you have encroached. So, you know, we talked about thinking about, you know, the moment when Scamander appears to Achilles is precisely in the form of a no, and Demeter comes forth only at the moment of the no. Socrates' daimonion comes forth at the moment of the no, and I didn't know, you know, I mean, it seems to me that this is becoming something to take up in thinking about what the space of that interpolation is opened up by. And there's a kind of extra layer to this in you know, I think where what you're sort of working through as an ethics of nature, what the kind of ethics of nature is made possible. Like, it strikes me that whereas the negativity, one might say, is problematic, and I'd be curious to hear what you think about that, you know, it's worth thinking through the kind of affirmation is also problematic, because if, you know, if we actually think about a kind of place where nature becomes visible and says yes, we're in the kind of space of Hellenistic naturalism and a kind of naturalistic, you know, kind of, you know, moving towards a pure naturalism where everything I'm doing is given to me by nature. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I wonder against that foil whether the no becomes sort of the sort of only possible, like the only possible encounter with nature, or a kind of juncture between nature and ethics that is actually free. So I just didn't know if you wanted to speak to that kind of conflation opened up by the Socratic material.
Yeah, I mean, the way I'm thinking about this, I mean, you know, I mean, in terms of the Callimachus hymn, right? I mean, the sort of the loss of the sort of, you know, the withdrawal of daimonic guidance, right? I mean, is the kind of, you know, retreat of the sort of, you know, unreflective form of living with nature, right? You know, which Schiller doesn't want to sort of give reasons for. So I'm seeing that as the moment of the kind of, the sort of withdrawal of sort of naturalness, you know, for which Schiller does not want to give reasons, right? And, you know, which, you know, people who've taken up, you know, that essay for, you know, sort of thinking about, you know, Hellenistic poetry and sort of the trajectory of Greek poetry more generally, have wanted to supply, right? I mean, what you get is kind of infilling, right? It's got something to do with, you know, the Hellenistic urbanism, or a kind of, you know, sort of hypertrophic efflorescence of kind of philosophy, which no one can kind of take seriously anymore. And, you know, but I'm more interested in the kind of not giving of reasons, right? And that it's that's kind of enacted in, you know, the non-discursiveness. I mean, it's that's enacted in the kind of, you know, the withdrawal of the daimon from, you know, not just Erysichthon. I think it's, you know, from Erysichthon's people, right? I mean, it is figured at, you know, the level of the genos, right? I mean, there's a kind of withdrawal of guidance, right? Which was, you know, which was sort of caused them to live sort of prosperously but unreflectively, right? That's the answer to the first part of maybe an answer to the first part of your question. I mean, I think you might have to ask me the second part again. So I sort of lost it in responding to the first part. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. It becomes a question of, like, I'll just say one thing. I mean, the moment where human nature actually emerges as different from nature as a whole. I mean, so if I was asking about a sort of naturalistic ethic, what is the kind of space in which nature becomes ethical? At some level, what the story that you just explained, it's like there's not a coincidence then that ethical naturalism coincides with Hellenistic poetry.
Right. No, I think that's right. No, yeah,
That's really
yeah,
helpful to think
yeah,
about that conflation, maybe.
yeah. No, I agree with that. Yeah.
Would you join me in thanking the panel for their very rich papers?